Despite Arsenal beating Porto on penalties to reach the quarterfinals of the Champions League, there definitely wasn't the best performance that they have had this season. Now, while Porto were very good, let's look at why Arsenal can learn from this game and take this into the next rounds of the tournament to hopefully progress further along. Let's get into it. Now, I do a lot of videos about the tactical prowess of Arteta and why it works, but I think it's good to always look at why it didn't work and how Porto were able to counter us in these two games. Now, I've already spoken about the first game and they actually changed up the system quite a bit from the second game, and I think there's some lessons Arsenal can learn going into the future of not what to do in Europe. Now, first of all, I think the reason why Arsenal struggle in this competition compared to the Premier League is because it is a different ball game. It's not necessarily better or harder, it's just necessarily a lot different that we're not going to be used to. Arsenal are elite in their own box and between both boxes. This is why they have scored the most goals in the Premier League and conceding the least. They are very good at dominating the ball and keeping teams penned in, having the ball and having dictating of what's going to happen. However, in Europe, it's not really like that. Champions League is kind of in nature a transitional based system. Every team is going to be quite aggressive to win the ball back, and it all matters about how quick you are from going attack to defense or defense to attack rather than having complete control, because that's just not going to happen against these top teams. And now going into future rounds as well, something that needs to be clear is that teams do have elite attack, especially in transition. You look at the likes of people like Kylian Mbappe and Vinicius Jr., they can definitely destroy you in transition and run up the pitch. And Arsenal aren't really like that. They kind of need to have sustained possession and build up with the ball slowly or even fast, but having everyone sort of work with it in order to actually create sustainable chances. Saka is a superstar, but he's not going to be very good in this role and often wants the ball to him a bit later, but he's going to get 2v1'd and it's going to be hard for him like it was in this game. Now, something that was clear in this Porto tie was that they do have the players that can dominate teams like Porto, but they weren't able to because Porto were very aggressive out of possession and really forced Arsenal into a lot of mistakes they didn't expect to make. It also undeniably were actually more braver than Arsenal and wanted to create chances. Arsenal didn't really want to take many risks and got put into situations where they were a bit worried about what was going to happen to them rather than actually using the ability that we know they have. If they aren't getting this control against Porto, you don't expect them to have the ability or the quality wise to actually have this control against the other teams in the Champions League who are going to be a lot better. Now, something that was clear to me was that Porto are always a couple of steps ahead of Arsenal and they can't make sure this happens in any other game. In the first game, they often suffocated Arsenal in midfield and didn't allow them to play their game. But in the second game, it was a completely different situation. Jorginho obviously came in, and instead Porto in the first leg, they had an out of possession system of 4-4-2 and sort of marked all the midfielders that way. But in this game, they changed it to a 4-3-3 and had someone on every single midfielder for Arsenal. This meant they could always have someone on Jorginho, keeping it close to him, making sure he couldn't really have much time on the ball so he couldn't actually get the time he wanted. And the two strikers would actually go and press the centre backs, so they'd also not get a lot of possession. Now, sometimes when Ben White came on the ball, obviously Nico Gonzalez would leave Odegaard and go over to Ben White. This did give some space to Odegaard in the first half in between the half spaces. Porto were very well drilled, and this is something that's going to happen. Porto ran back a lot of the times and often dispossessed Odegaard even when he was in front of them. And while doing this on that side, on the other side, they weren't really worried about Kiwior inverting or going up the pitch too much. So instead, they actually just had Pepe mark Rice tightly and not actually move from him, and Rice really couldn't get on the ball. Now, one time Arsenal did actually get away from this was the goal. Jorginho came deeper to pick the ball up because Varela, the guy marking him, would only really mark him when he got near to the halfway line. This allowed Jorginho to do his passing from the midfield up to the pitch, and obviously Odegaard had that space because he's peeling off the defenders. Odegaard does brilliantly to basically bait four people into going one way and passes it in behind the defender who had lost Trossard, who did good movement to get in and scored. However, a lot of the game they really couldn't do this because Porto were pressing them very high and they were making sure they made mistakes. Jorginho needed to come deeper, and this is something that might need to happen in the next games, and he is going to be forced into losing the ball in situations you don't want him to because he will get pressed really high. And I think that's what I've said before, when he gets pressed, when he has not a lot of time with the ball, you see Jorginho not being very good because his mobility, and there was a few times that they played through the lines and he's just not simply going to catch up because he's not that quick. And to be honest, I think this all happened because Porto were one step ahead of Arsenal at all times. Arsenal knew after the first game they needed more runners in behind and they needed to actually start pinging them balls to the wingers and Havertz, who was making them runs. Now, in this game, Porto had a mid to high line sometimes and also had a low block in some other times when Arsenal pressed up the pitch. And in order to make sure they didn't get past it over the back, which we only saw happen a couple of times, they often made sure Jorginho and Odegaard couldn't really get them passes in because they didn't have enough time. They didn't really worry about Havertz, and there's a few times he did actually get in, but it weren't really an effective thing. So Porto potentially countered that, really the big point for Arsenal they could have done in the first leg. And Arsenal did try to use other players to make them runs. They really wanted Trossard to make them, but he's not really familiar and really suited to this sort of style, especially because he was so deep on that left side. If you had someone like Martinelli, it probably would have been a lot better because he's very good at them sort of runs and going in behind. We did see it for the second goal, which did get disallowed, where Havertz finally got in behind. But even then, the pass wasn't really to him, and he does foul Pepe, who ends up walking into his goalkeeper. Then Odegaard scored. And if that was enabled to count, it would have been a very lucky goal. But that was what Arsenal were trying to do a lot more. And you might have seen it a lot in this game, but a lot of things that Porto did really well when they were building up themselves is they actually made it so Havertz and Odegaard, the main pressers for Arsenal, had to cover a lot of ground. Odegaard was often having to pick up the guy on the right side, have to go all the way there because the centre-back split much deeper. And this often created spaces in midfield when they built up. And there was a few times where they had a midfielder would come into that space because Arsenal would basically try to cover the two centre-backs going so deep on the right and left side. But they were just able to pick the ball up and run into space because you know Jorginho isn't going to catch them and everyone else was pressing other men. Now this obviously is very risky. I think in the first half Odegaard did actually win the ball back from one of the defenders and they had a good chance. But obviously when you've got great passes and you will be playing big teams, they're going to be doing this a lot more. So Arsenal might need to sit off people rather than just pressing really high because it's not necessarily going to cause much progress. And if not, they could just run through the midfield in the future. Now Arsenal would definitely improve later on in the game, which they would take solace from when Jorginho came off and Rice played in that 6th role. Rice was able to get a little bit more time and space on the ball, and he was able to track runners a bit more because obviously he's very much a good sweeper and could run around much more of the pitch than Jorginho could. But he still didn't get a lot of time on the ball in certain situations because they were very hard on the tackle and very quick at passing. But this also gave Arsenal a lot more presence going forward because also we brought Jesus on with a lot more runners in there, which they were finding it hard to actually track and which Jesus nearly scored from straight away. But Porto were in a low block at this point and they defended really well for the next 20 minutes and the half an hour of extra time. But that is when Arsenal were really at their best and really caging Porto in. And one of the biggest problems about Arsenal's build-up was the fact that Martin Odegaard and Ben White did not get enough time on the ball. Martin Odegaard, 120 minutes, got 56 touches on the ball, and we can all agree that they were brilliant touches. He was so good in the game, but he needs to be on the ball more. He needed to pick the ball up from deeper and help Arsenal in that double pivot with Rice like we've seen before, and have Ben White invert when he goes out into the position to go further forward. This helps Arsenal sustain attack and probably get more players passing it around the back so they can't keep pressing so hard. This also allows Odegaard to dictate the game a lot more and actually be on the ball creating more chances, being able to pick passes from deep because we know he's a brilliant passer as well. Something like this would mean Jorginho probably wouldn't be very viable in the team, and I think probably for the Champions League that might not be the best option depending on obviously who we play. But that is something we definitely need to get better in these games. And while you can also say things about Saliba and Gabriel probably needing to be a bit more better technically and making their passes, their long passes a lot better, overall Arsenal got the win in the end, and they will take a lot of credit and a lot of belief that they can go very far in this competition because they played really poorly and honestly got tactically outplayed but still went through in the end. And I think Arteta has learned a lot about probably what works in these games and probably what doesn't, and it will definitely help Arsenal playing a team like Porto, a very good defensive side that have great system will play like that, rather than a team necessarily like Real Madrid who are probably going to be a lot more attacking and not really care about what Arsenal do. But let me know what you guys think, and thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.